And could you describe what was the very first experience?
Yeah, so for me personally, the experience was simply just flying out to the area like I would any other day. And instead of seeing an empty airspace with just my wing person or another squadron doing something a different block, there were all of a sudden a lot of different radar contacts, which is immediately a problem because, we could be hitting one of those or someone working in our area. And this was happening because we upgraded our radar the best we could tell. We were in a earlier radar called the APG-73, and we had come back from deployment. We entered a maintenance phase, it's called. We kind of do a little bit less flying, upgrade the jets if we need to, do any long-lasting maintenance, and we upgraded to the APG-79, which was a much better radar.
So you have this upgraded radar system, and what are you detecting?
So on the radar, really what we can learn from that is essentially the kinematics of the object. So where is it essentially, and what direction is it going, how fast is it going, things of that nature. We can't necessarily make out the shape or things of that nature. So it's a representation. It's like a block on our screen to show that information. And so when we see that on our radar, we can tell where it's located, perhaps what's located around it if there's other objects we're detecting, how fast it's going, what direction it's pointed in, what direction it's traveling in. So we call that velocity vector. So if we see this essentially little circle, it'll have a tail coming off of it. And that tail kind of represents the nose of the vehicle, at least as its flight path is going. And so with that, we would typically see an aircraft just kind of trudging along with a straight line, taking occasional turns.
But how fast are these things going?
So sometimes stationary, right? Sometimes they would be going around 0.6 to 0.8 Mach, which is at altitude about 240 to maybe 330 knots, around there.
So somewhere in the range of an airplane.
Yeah, a fighter aircraft would be kind of flying around at those airspeeds, except sometimes they would be perfectly stationary as well.
Right. So it's not exhibiting any sort of patterns that you've recognized in the past.
No, they have actually. So although
but with the stationary, no, right?
Correct. With the stationary, no. With the meandering kind of flight path, no. But I would also see them essentially fly what we call a racetrack pattern. And essentially what that means is they fly in a straight path, and then they do like a 180-degree turn in a certain direction. Then they fly a straight path, then turn again. So that's what we call a racetrack pattern as opposed to a circular holding pattern. We did witness racetrack patterns. In fact, I think there's been some cases off the West Coast just the past couple of weeks where people have also been observing objects flying in racetrack patterns high at altitude with lights. So I do recognize that behavior, but I don't necessarily think that means we have to attribute it to normal behavior necessarily. That type of flight path is important because it's a very efficient way to fly, right? If you have to maintain the position in a certain area, you want to minimize how much you're turning. Because anytime you're turning in an aircraft, you're using more energy than if you were just flying straight and level.
How long can you guys stay up in an F-18?
If we're dogfighting, about an hour. If we're holding at 0.6 to 0.8 Mach, like I described them as doing, somewhere maybe around like 2.5 hours maximum.
And you think that these things are up there for far longer than that.
Mm-hmm.
So how big was this thing when this guy saw it?
So it's very difficult to tell in the air, but because they were flying in formation, we can make some estimated guesses essentially, and that's what we did when we talked about it afterwards, right? So the aircraft were about 100 feet apart. This thing, they estimate it essentially split the section, which means it went more or less right down the middle, but slightly closer to lead, which would put it somewhere less than 50 feet, on average, if they're about 100 feet. And then he essentially used that size reference to say, hey, this might have been somewhere in like the 5 to 15, foot diameter. It's, not a tight guess, but that's the best we could come up with.
And what is it like? Like what's the atmosphere like when you go back to the base? Are you allowed to discuss this? Is this something that's openly talked about? Is this something that you get ridiculed for?
It's just, like you would expect any group of, dude and dudettes, hearing about this to just kind of, do the normal reaction like anyone else and to kind of, make the jokes and then kind of get back to work essentially because we're just so busy at this time, right? We're getting ready for war. For a lot of us, this is the apex of our career sense, to get ready for deployment, and it's kind of like the long blade gets cut in a sense in a fighter community like that. It's very much a trust-based organizations.
That's got to be a very bizarre feeling. You're flying around in these jets, preparing for deployment, and you see things that are, if not unexplainable, haven't been explained yet.
Mm-hmm. It just didn't fit into our framework, right? Even if we look at, when we really kind of were trying to hash it out in the squadron, it's, so, okay, what could these be? And even the classified, drone thing, and I'm not even going to consider all the things that have happened since then, but even at this time, the drone thing didn't make sense to us for a number of reasons. One of those is, why, right? Why do we have potentially hundreds or more, small drones that can perform better than anything we've seen, just hanging out, for years off the coast?
And is there a visible method of propulsion that's coming from these objects?
No.
What about a heat signature?
No. So so there's no plume of heat coming out the back. There's no propellers. There's no wing surfaces that we've seen.
And when you're looking at it, are you looking at it through some sort of an infrared that will detect heat?
Mm-hmm.
You don't see anything.
Usually through infrared, yeah. And so it'll come back as either a white hut or a dark hut, which means black color represents heat.
Hut? What is hut?
It's essentially, if we're looking at like an object against a blue sky, if that thing's producing heat, then it's going to come out white in white hut. Right. So if I see a white object, it's going to be a hot object, and the sky is going to look blue.
What's that word hut you're using?
HOT.
HOT. Oh,
yeah,
hot.
like the temperature.
Like hot.
Hot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Little New England accent coming out.
No,
there,
it's okay. I'm from New England too. I thought it was something else. I thought it was like a technical term.
Yeah. It would just be like either all like completely one temperature essentially, right? It wasn't like the skin of an aircraft you could see. It was just kind of like an emission of IR energy, like a flashlight, right? Sometimes, most of the time, it would be cold. It was like a cold object, so it didn't appear to actually be emitting heat.
Wow. So when these things are happening every day, and all these different pilots are experiencing them every day, this is essentially just from the moment of 2014-ish when this new radar system gets implemented. So you had one sense of what was out there, and then all of a sudden you have these new systems, and now you're like, whoa, this is littered with these things.
Yeah.
What is that like? What is that like? What for you personally? What does that feel like?
It's just comforting. We spend a lot of time and energy on the most basic aspects of flight, in a sense, right? Because if you can't just operate safely, right, you can't come back and land and manage your fuel and not bust through altitudes and all that, you can't do all the other stuff, right? And so we're very particular on those type of details. So to have someone operating in that area would be a massive oversight. So it was, in a sense, we kind of, at least I did, felt a bit let down, right? It was like, someone should be willing to look at this and deal with this problem. If it was going to constantly, it was not that it was constantly getting laughed at. It's just we always had bigger fish to fry, essentially, right? Which I respect and I understand, but it doesn't mean we completely ignore that, right? And we have to do more than just, we have responsibility, I think, as aviators when we're up there to report really what we're seeing, because we're on the front line of what we can see up there. And if, we don't have the command or operational support to, tell the truth about what we're seeing up there, then, things have to change.